All right, Sue is the next person to ask Peter Dutton a question here as we're live doing a pub test from a pub here in Brisbane. What's your question for the man who may be PM?
Thank you, Peter, for doing what you're doing. Really appreciate it. My question is, what is your position on the Paris Agreement in regard to net zero emissions by 2050?
Well, Sue, thank you. It's a good question, and it's on the minds of many Australians. I think what we need to do, and what we've announced that we'll do in relation to the energy policy, is that we need to have cheaper electricity. First point, we're paying 3 times the cost of electricity compared to Wyoming or Tennessee or Ontario, to other comparable cities and nations around the world. So the first thing is price, and at the moment there's no regard for price. It just seems that people are expected to pay more and more, and under this government, electricity's gone up by about 32% and gas has gone up by 34%. We need to make sure that power is reliable, and the independent energy regulator at the moment is warning that there will be blackouts and brownouts under the government's renewables-only policy. And we've got trading relationships, and we've got a position in the world where we've signed up to an agreement where we commit to reducing emissions into the future as well. And we've got to get the balance right. We've got renewables that are in the system now, but we can't pretend that renewables are running this pub now of a night time, or running the hospital, or running the cold rooms at Coles or Woolies or the IGA store. So we've got to get the balance right. Now, we say that we need more gas in the system. Chris Bowen won't mention the word gas because it's a fossil fuel. The Labor Party in Victoria is signing up to extend the life of coal-fired power stations because they know the lights are going out without it. And we've said with an East Coast gas reserve, we can bring in about an extra 50 to 100 petajoules. It'll reduce the price from $14 a gigajoule down to $10, and that will have a very significant impact for businesses. And don't forget that gas is a big component in the generation of electricity. So it will help not just the commercial and industrial application, but households as well. And we'll release more detail in relation to that. So we've got to get the balance right. And I think the views of Australians, my sense is that this debate is evolving, and I think it'll be a very different debate in the coming years as well, because people are looking at their power bills each month. The Prime Minister promised they'd go down by $275, and they've gone up by $1,300. And Australians are now being told, well, you'll just have to factor in blackouts and brownouts, and I just don't think that's acceptable to our country.
Also, I mean, inevitably, if we'd end up in this minority government scenario, we know there's legislated cuts 43% to 1% of the world's problems. However, many of the Teals, community independents, they have said that they want 75%. The Greens suggest 75% and above much sooner than those things. How important is it to you that, again, there are going to be lots of people that are going to say, I'm not going to go team red, team blue, but the people who are thinking outside of those two things, that your preferences matter because there are consequences to it with things like that?
But, Paul, preferences will matter at this election more than any recent election. Let's be clear about it. The rise of independence, even in our own electorate here, we've got somebody who is a Green pretending to be a community representative funded by a billionaire out of Sydney and not being honest with the electorate about where the money's coming from. But the reality is that the Teals, let's say Monique Ryan in Victoria, or Zoe Daniel in Victoria, or Kate Chaney in Western Australia, these people have voted with the Greens on 70+% of the occasions where they've had to vote in the Parliament. And it's this complete and utter sort of fraud in terms of they on the one hand say that they're all about integrity and honesty and openness, but the reality is that they would only support a Labor government. And that much should be clear to voters when people turn up, because if you're voting for a Teal or if you're voting for a community independent, that vote ultimately is going to end up with either the Liberal Party or the Labor Party in most circumstances. And in that circumstance, you have to put Labor last if you're not putting the Liberal Party first. And I think the reality for a lot of people is that we don't like either party. Let's just vote for somebody who seems innocuous, somebody who says that they're a disaffected Liberal in the case of some of the Teals. But the reality is that their agenda is a really hardcore Green left agenda. And the Prime Minister can only form a government after the next election in concert, in collaboration in partnership with Adam Bant from the Greens and with the Green Teals. And that, to me, is going to be a recipe for higher spending, which will mean higher inflation, which will mean higher interest rates again, and a lot of debt that we just can't afford as a country.
Well, and just to that extension, right, I was noticing today in one of the press conferences, the old question comes up about, Prime Minister, are you Greens preferences? Well, of course, the National Executive of the Labor Party are the ones who decide that, and guess who happens to have the casting vote on the National Executive? But he was trying to make it seem like it's other people somewhere else that make a decision. Where does the LNP, the Liberal Party, the National Party, all the versions of what it will take to build your coalition, where are the Greens going?
Well, let's have a think about the Greens and should we, as a party, support the Greens or preference the Greens? Well, the Greens believe in defunding the Australian Defence Force. They believe in the criminalisation of hardcore drugs. They have a radical agenda otherwise, which is about everything but the environment. So, no, they will go last for us. And that's the principled stance that we've taken. Now, the Labor Party can't survive without the Greens' preferences. And that's why the Prime Minister, who has used his casting vote on the federal executive to appoint candidates in multiple seats overriding the wishes of the local Labor Party branch members,
correct,
he's exerted that power, exercised that power in that circumstance. And so this whole, I don't know anything about the preferences, that's for somebody else to do. The Prime Minister, as each of his predecessors has done, will take the preferences, will give the Greens preferences ahead of us. And I think Australians see that it's a giant con job because the Greens and the Labor Party are joined at the hip. And the left of the Labor Party now, run by Tanya Plibersek and others, Chris Bowen and others, I mean, you see the results already. And Tanya Plibersek has tried to close down the salmon industry in Tasmania, tried to stop gas exploration in Western Australia, has tried to stop the agricultural industry in Western Australia, all because she's trying to please a Green voter in inner city Sydney and Melbourne. Why has the government taken an anti-Semitic stance and abandoned the Jewish community in the last period over this last couple of years? Well, because they're worried about Greens in inner city Sydney and Melbourne. And I think it's been one of the most shameful demonstrations by the Labor Party in relation to each of those issues, the environment, the anti-Semitism and a number of other issues. And I think the Prime Minister has been caught out in that regard.